Okay then, in our exam we have two source questions on two controversies. The second controversy essentially is why did the North win the Civil War? A relatively simple sounding controversy, but there are more than one explanation as to why the North won. If there was any one factor that was definitive, that would make for a rather simple answer, and sadly edXL are not into allowing us off the hook with simple answers. So suffice to say there are a multitude of reasons why the North did win, and I'm going to try and talk you through some of those, so contain your excitement, and here we go. The first and a very obvious reason would be that the North had a superiority in both population and industry. To evidence this point, the North boasted a population of 22 million, an ever-growing population of 22 million with immigration and high birth rates, compared to the South, which had a far more static growth, shown by the representation in the House of Representatives in antebellum America. But the South in 1861 had a population of 9 million, of whom only 5 million were white. Those 4 million slaves clearly not being allowed to join the army for one reason: giving slaves weapons was not seen as a great idea by white slave owners, but perhaps more important philosophically was that the whole argument of racial superiority as espoused by Alexander Stephens, the vice president, would be null and void if the Confederacy allowed blacks into the army. So suffice to say that Lee did want to draft blacks into the army come 1865, but his desire was too late and was not actioned by the Confederate Congress. The significance of this is twofold. Obviously, the North had a larger army, and when they suffered casualties were more easily able to replace them with fighting men, in contrast to the South, but also that the North was able to keep their factories manned, and as I believe I've mentioned, the North in 1865 is far wealthier than it is when it enters the war in 1861, which really did set a precedent. Another significant factor under population would be the hundreds of thousands of slaves who ran away in the South when the Northern armies were close, and those runaway slaves went on to be employed in the service of the Union Army in either military combat or in manual labour. The other side of this coin would be industry, and the North boasted a 9-to-1 ratio of industrial output over the South. For instance, 97% of shoes were produced in the North. The North had twice as much rail as the South, and produced 30 times as many firearms. Remember, the South was heavily reliant on imports, which were strangled somewhat progressively by the naval blockade in force since 1861. In addition to this, the hard war tactics used by Generals Grant, Sherman and Sheridan just killed the South, and the South could not replace what was destroyed. Machinery was broken and couldn't be replaced. Rail lines were dug up and were not able to be replaced. Whilst the fighting was happening in the South, it was not happening in the North, it was happening in the South, and the South, to an extent, by 1865, was morally, economically and physically exhausted and beaten. However, in history, the smaller side has won before, so that alone is not sufficient. Certainly it contributes. I wouldn't underestimate its significance, but it's not enough alone. So perhaps we look at the generals, the people in charge of leading these armies, and there's certainly a perception that the South had the better generals. Bear in mind, if the South had the better generals, they led the better armies, they fought the better battles, and they still lost. Clearly that makes no sense. What we can do, and this is a podcast, this isn't a book, so I'm going to abbreviate. Crudely put, the CSA had their A team in Virginia faced by the Union B team. And it was an opposite scenario in the West, where the best Northern generals found themselves face to face with lesser able Southern generals. Let's evidence this. Robert E. Lee in Virginia, ably supported by Generals Jackson and Longstreet, soundly thumped a succession of, should we be polite and say limited northern generals? There's McDowell, McClellan, twice McClellan, Burnside, Pope and Hooker. But then in the Union in the West were under Grant, Sherman and Sheridan, and they wholly dominated Joe Johnston. There was Beauregard for a while, Albert Sidney Johnston, the first leader. There was Braxton Bragg, who spent most of the war quarrelling rather than fighting, and then of course John Bell Hood, who Lee himself said was all lion and none of the fox. You know, a brave man for sure, but whether he was a capable leader is negligible. Let's see, when Grant faced Lee from 1863 onwards, the results were different, commencing with Gettysburg and ending with surrender at Appomattox. Yeah, sure, the CSA had an advantage in the East up until 1863, but at that same time the Union were winning in the West, and it's not as cool, it's not as sexy, but that was what was happening. New Orleans falls in 1862. So maybe this leads us to a third consideration. Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee is seen as the hero of the South, a man idolised still. If you know, the car in the Dukes of Hazzard is the General Robert E. Lee. Who was this guy? He was head of one of America's oldest families, a die-hard loyal Virginian who seceded after the attack on Fort Sumter, and he headed the Confederate troops in Virginia after the near-fatal injury to Joe Johnston in 1862 near Richmond. Lee is criticised for concentrating his troops in Virginia and leaving the Western theatre undermanned and under-resourced. Well, you know, Lee is a Virginian. He was head of the Virginian troops. It is not his problem what was going on in the West. More accurate in saying it wasn't his problem. It was not his responsibility. The overall leader was Jefferson Davis, and Jefferson Davis decided which troops were deployed where. We've already discussed the population, so there's a limit to what Davis can do. Let's be clear, though, that Northern morale was killed by Robert E. Lee. Time and time again, Lee won in the East, and the North came closer and closer to giving up. They were losing the will to continue. Twice, Robert E. Lee invades the North. And what does he do? Why is he doing this? I've said before that the South did not need to invade the North, but he tried to kill their will, their passion to continue. Also, if the fighting wasn't happening in Virginia, they could grow crops in Virginia and keep the war going. And it's no coincidence that James McPherson said that the South nearly won the war 3 times, and all 3 times it was down to Robert E. Lee. Now, Lee is also criticised for his adherence to the offensive-defensive strategy, that he was too much of an attacker, that his victories came at too high a cost, and that in essence he bled the South to death. Sure, Lee is responsible for the deaths of approximately 70,000 troops from 1862 through to 1865, but let's perhaps compare him with the most well-known exponent of defensive war, General Joe Johnston, who gave up huge amounts of land in Virginia in 1862 and Georgia in 1864 without a struggle. Now, I and many other historians would contend that that was far more damaging to Southern morale than defeat by arms. Well, let's face it, Lee was not defeated in 1863. So, you know, Johnston gave up land without a fight, and that was hurting Southern morale. South are very proud people, or were a very proud people. What is perhaps more accurate to say that is, if it was not for Robert E. Lee, the war would not have continued so long. The North would have won quicker. So to blame Robert E. Lee for the South's defence is, well, it's unconvincing. Perhaps we could look at the fights, the battles, the military victories, and George Pickett, who led that ill-fated charge of 15,000 men at Gettysburg, said in a reunion years afterwards, when asked why the South were defeated, he said, "I think the Yankees had something to do with it." Huge Union victories in this turning point of a year, this pivotal year, 1863, and they all happened within about a month of each other. The Battle of Gettysburg shattered this illusion of Lee's invincibility. The Fall of Vicksburg, after a long siege, gave control of the Mississippi River in its entirety to the north, and Chattanooga really showed that in the west, the South under Bragg were on a loser, frankly. Were military victories the only reason? Well, clearly they're not an independent factor. They rely on the population, industry, generals. So certainly they contributed. But other arguments put forward would be the view that the South died because of democracy, an argument put forward by David Donald, and one that is particularly unconvincing. Donald said that if Davis had been firmer in ending Southern civil liberties, that the South would somehow have won, and this theory holds little or no water. The thought that if Davis had led a government that was restrictive of free speech and the South would have won because of this is... Can we say bollocks? It's certainly nonsense. It's not very convincing. Nor either is the argument put forward by David Potter, who basically said that if the Union and Confederacy had exchanged presidents with one another, the CSA might have won its independence. And sure, we see Lincoln has numerous advantages. He had good relationships with his cabinet. Lincoln was seen as standing up to slave power, and it was Lincoln, of course, who masterminded and issued the Emancipation Proclamation. However, Davis has many strengths as well as him who appointed Robert E. Lee, and Robert E. Lee himself said there was no one better than Davis, no one around who could have done a better job. Davis toured the South extensively, even in poor health, really suffered from ailments such as neuralgia and other painful things, and let's not forget Jefferson's experience as an administrator, senator for Mississippi, and a competent politician. Sure, the South suffered from inflation, but that was to an extent unavoidable because of the naval blockade. To blame Davis for that would be inaccurate, and let's not forget that the Confederacy, although down to its bare bones, was still able to equip its army up until 1865 under the Ordnance Group under the leadership of Josiah Gorgas, that famous Pennsylvanian who would rather stay loyal to his southern wife than fight for the North. Other historians point to missed Confederacy opportunities, chances the CSA had to strike the Union, chances they did not take, and chances that in not taking led to their ultimate defeat and demise. We'd look at the Battle of First Manassas and the South's inability under Beauregard to follow up McDowell's retreat. We could look at Jackson's inadequate performance in the 7 Days War, where McClellan could have been wiped off the battlefield. This most remarkable scene in 1862, when Robert E. Lee's orders for the invasion of the North fell into the hands of McClellan himself. Telling McClellan that Lee had split his numerically smaller forces in two, leading to the Battle of Antietam. Jackson's death after the victory at Chancellorsville, shot by his own side and then recovering from that only to die of pneumonia. If your luck's not in, it's not in. And also the leadership of the CSA in 1863. Robert E. Lee perhaps overconfident at Gettysburg, the incompetence at Vicksburg, and speaking of incompetence, Braxton Bragg and his leadership at Chattanooga. Another point could be Southern division. Jefferson Davis was continually at war with Beauregard and Joe Johnston, a man with a highly inflated view of himself. Other historians point to the women of the Confederacy bringing the CSA to its knees because of their imploring of their husbands to desert and come back to the farms. States' rights advocates such as Governor Brown of Georgia and Governor Zebulon Vance of North Carolina, Brown not wanting to send Georgian troops anywhere outside of Georgia, or Vance wanting to keep every blockade runner's goods that ported in North Carolina solely in North Carolina. Sure, these guys didn't help, but I'd refer you back to Pickett and the fact that it was the North rather than any Southern mistakes. Finally, the argument that it was a rich man's war but a poor man's fight, the fact that the war was fought for slavery by the planters to protect slavery, and that it was the poor non-slave holders who fought and died and bled for the South in a war that wouldn't help them. But this is not true. We don't have time to go on to white dedication to slavery, but the South was united pretty much in defence of slavery, and very few wealthy men escaped the draft or even wanted to. Point to people like Wade Hampton, who recruited, equipped and trained their troops. The final factor would be the lack of intervention from Great Britain. This is one that you can talk about for ages. Thankfully for you, I won't be talking about it for ages. But let's just say that for Great Britain, they were never going to enter on the side of the South, with the South so passionately supporting slavery, remembering that Britain had abolished slavery a little matter of 2 decades or so before. Great Britain, they would have liked to, or some in the cabinet, Palmerston amongst them, Gladstone amongst them, would have liked to have intervened on behalf of the South and split America in two, thus crippling a major economic and potentially military rival. However, let's not underestimate the amount of support in favour of the North in Britain. People like Richard Cobden, John Bright, very much the progressives of the day, and representatives of this kind of nascent working class belief in liberty in the United Kingdom. But in practicality, Great Britain would never involve themselves in the war on behalf of the South if it looked like the South was going to win. However, the South was never likely to win unless Great Britain intervened. So that is a dichotomy, and that is the end of this podcast. I hope it was helpful. Goodbye.